Folliculogenesis is the process of the follicle developing. Don't forget, an ovarian follicle includes the egg and the surrounding cells. We've already looked at oogenesis, the process of the egg developing. So this video looks at the rest of the follicle as it develops. There are stages to folliculogenesis, and some of these have kind of similar names to those in oogenesis. We're going to start off with a primordial follicle, and then we have a primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, and then a mature or Graafian follicle. So these are the different stages that the follicle goes through during its development process. The primordial follicle is the state of follicles in the ovaries. Most of the follicles, whether we're looking at a very young female or an older female, most of the follicles are in the primordial stage. So the primordial follicle is actually the state of the follicle from birth to menopause, with just one exception, monthly after puberty. We'll talk about that more in a minute. The primordial follicle tends to contain a primary oocyte plus a very thin layer of cells surrounding that primary oocyte. Starting at puberty, hormones will cause just one primordial follicle, and it's not one per ovary, just one primordial follicle in one of the ovaries to enter into the next stage of folliculogenesis, which is the primary follicle. Primary follicles tend to contain a primary or a secondary oocyte depending upon the stage of oogenesis. And there's still a layer of cells here, but a much thicker layer of cells because that follicle is developing. Next, that primary follicle will develop into a secondary follicle. Basically, this is very similar to a primary follicle, but just bigger. Right? The oocyte is bigger, and the layer of cells surrounding the oocyte have multiplied, and that layer of cells is even thicker. At this point, we can definitely identify unique cells in the follicle, such as the granulosa cells and the thecal cells. Thecal cells are also known as theca folliculi cells. The secondary follicle develops into a tertiary follicle. The tertiary follicle contains a secondary oocyte, which has a layer of cells on the outside of it, and then there's a large space that's now quite obvious called the antrum. And then that antrum is surrounded by a thick layer of cells, and all of that is part of the follicle. The antrum contains a fluid called follicular fluid, and as this follicle continues to develop, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. One of the reasons why it's getting bigger is because that antrum is getting bigger, and there's more follicular fluid being put into that antrum. The thecal cells that I mentioned previously start to produce hormones at this point. These hormones are converted by the granulosa cells into estrogen. So we say that the granulosa cells are producing estrogen, but technically it's the thecal cells that make the precursor to estrogen, and the granulosa cells take that precursor and turn it into what we know as estrogen. But we say the granulosa cells produce estrogen. The tertiary follicle will then become a mature or Graafian follicle. We still have a secondary oocyte. We still have a very large follicle. At this point, the follicle is huge, and it's ready for ovulation. Ovulation is the process of the ovary releasing the oocyte into the fluid surrounding the ovary. Once the oocyte is released into that fluid, fimbriae, which are basically the little ends of the fallopian tubes, fimbriae, these finger-like projections, sweep the egg into the fallopian tube. After ovulation, the follicle is not finished yet. The follicle gets repaired, and it gets changed into a new structure called the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum means yellow-bodied structure, and this structure is indeed yellow. The corpus luteum is really important because it produces the other female hormone, progesterone. Progesterone is needed to maintain pregnancy. It's a hormone that tells the uterus to maintain the endometrium lining. And this is important because the very early embryo will attach to the endometrium. And if the endometrium is shed during menstruation, the embryo will be shed too. So progesterone basically prevents menstruation from occurring. This image shows the stages of folliculogenesis, starting with the primordial follicle, which is the state of most follicles. Once a month after puberty, one primordial follicle is selected to turn into a primary follicle. And as we go from the primary follicle to the secondary and tertiary stages, you can see how that follicle is growing. The cells surrounding the oocyte are multiplying, and we're developing that antrum, that space, with the follicular fluid. The tertiary follicle eventually becomes the mature or Graafian follicle, which becomes ovulated. So here we can see the process of ovulation occurring. So when the oocyte is released, some of those granulosa cells are coming with it. Eventually, that ovulated follicle is repaired and reformed into the corpus luteum. This image here is showing a microscopic version of the follicle. So you can see the very large oocyte, and then you can see the developing cells around that oocyte. And this image here just shows folliculogenesis again. I think the labels are off a little bit. This is probably supposed to be the primordial follicle. Then we have our primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, and then our mature Graafian follicle that becomes ovulated, followed by the development of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum does degrade if an embryo is not detected, which is known by the presence of a hormone called HCG. So if that HCG is not detected, the corpus luteum will break down and the whole process will start over again.